This is going to be the last video in Unit 7. And Unit 7, we've been talking about direct reading instruments. And this is a little bit of a deviation away from direct reading instruments specifically. But this is the type, what I'm going to talk about in this video is the type of workplace scenario where direct reading instruments are very important. If we have workers that need to enter a potentially dangerous location, and when I say potentially dangerous location, I'm talking about the potential for a hazardous atmosphere. In 2016, there were 2 workers who were killed at a church camp in southern Oklahoma because they did not take the precautions necessary when entering the work location where they were killed. These links, this is the news coverage from 2016 that covered the incident, and also there's a link to the OSHA investigation and the OSHA material related to these 2 fatalities. I'm not going to open these links, but if you would like these links, let me know. I'll probably go ahead and take all of the links from this unit and put them on one page like I've done on previous units. Yeah, I'll just do that so you'll be able to go to the links. I am going to be talking about the OSHA investigation on the next slide. I'll have some of the details, some of the information from the investigation report. Anytime we have workers entering a potentially hazardous atmosphere, we need to sample in advance. We first need to ensure it's safe for entry. We can't just put a sniffer on them and send them inside of that tank or inside of the cement silo or the stormwater drainage structure. And what we're talking about here are confined spaces, but this is not limited to what OSHA would normally call a confined space. If there's an area, maybe it's a room in a facility that has a potentially hazardous atmosphere, we need to know what the concentrations are in that space before workers are going to go into that space. A lot of what we're hinting at or discussing in this video is a confined space, but it doesn't have to be a confined space. And I'm not going to talk specifically, regulation by regulation about confined spaces from an OSHA standpoint. I'm talking about it from a more practical standpoint. I'm talking about it from the standpoint of keeping workers safe. That's our objective. Not meeting the regulatory requirements, that's part of it, but we got to keep workers safe. And if we're keeping workers safe and going above and beyond the OSHA regulations, then the regulations aren't anything to worry about. Too many companies make the mistake of being compliance driven rather than proactive and driven by the prevention, driven by the safety of the workers. That should be our goal, not OSHA regulations. If we're doing everything that we need to do to keep workers safe, then the OSHA regulations aren't going to be a problem. Because usually to keep workers safe, you've got to go above and beyond OSHA regulations. So let's go ahead and talk about the Falls Creek case. In 2016, more specifically April 2nd, 2016, we had 2 employees that entered a hazardous atmosphere. They didn't know it was hazardous because they hadn't had the training. They hadn't taken any readings before entering the work location. Let me just read this to you. And this text is directly from the OSHA investigation. At approximately 9:22 a.m. on April 22nd, 2016, employee number 1 entered through a manhole and was working in a confined space. Employee number 1 had climbed down a ladder and entered the 12-foot deep manhole to read markings on a mixer plate. In the confined space, employee number 1 began to read the markings on the mixer plate to employee number 2. Employee number 2 was on the surface at this time. He had not entered. He had not descended the ladder. He was on the surface. He began to read the markings on the mixer plate to employee number 2. Employee number 1 then stood up and climbed a couple of ladder rungs, but lost consciousness and fell from the ladder. Employee number 2 radioed for help. Climbed down the ladder. This is where employee 2 made the mistake. He didn't have the training, didn't know any better, and then instincts are a part of it as well. But employee number 2, who was on the surface, climbed down the ladder to check on employee number 1. As employee number 2 was about a fourth of the way down the ladder, he also lost consciousness and fell from the ladder. Both employees died in an oxygen-deficient atmosphere with displacing gases that included carbon dioxide. And I said in the previous video that carbon dioxide can displace oxygen. That's what happened here. Now, when the first word went out about this accident, everybody immediately said it must have been hydrogen sulfide. It must have been hydrogen sulfide. But it wasn't hydrogen sulfide. It was just an oxygen-deficient atmosphere that resulted in the death of both men. And because they hadn't been trained, because they weren't following common sense, practical confined space procedures, they both died, which is so common in these types of incidents. First employee loses consciousness. The employee on the surface thinks, hey, I better go help my buddy. I better go check on him. So he goes down into that same atmosphere, and he also loses consciousness and loses his life. Again, both of these employees were killed in this incident when they entered this oxygen-deficient atmosphere. What we have here are the initial violations from OSHA. And again, I'm not really that worried about OSHA. OSHA is important, but it's more important to keep workers safe. But just for your information, for your experience, because you will be working with OSHA, they were initially issued 6 serious violations. The representative of Falls Creek was the camp in southern Oklahoma that where this took place. The representatives for Falls Creek, hopefully they had an attorney go in and represent them in a case like this, but they went in and they were able to negotiate that down to 4 current violations, or 4 serious and 3 other. Initially it was 6 serious and 1 other. When we say other violations, that means less than serious. So 4 serious and 3 other than serious or less than serious violations. The total was still the same, 7 total violations. The initial penalty was $67,700. That was negotiated down to $33,880 as a final settlement. And it's pretty easy to negotiate with OSHA and get the fines reduced. If you go in to the informal conference and you most of the time, if in a case like this you're going to admit guilt, you made mistakes, you want to do better, they're going to work with you and reduce that penalty. Here is an actual list of the violations if anybody wants to look up the standard numbers. Most of them are going to be confined space related, the OSHA confined space standard. But it was about the oxygen deficiency. It wasn't just because they violated the standards. It was because they didn't test in advance. They didn't know what they were entering. They didn't understand the potential for an oxygen deficient atmosphere. In this type of environment, bacterial activity can consume available oxygen. And as those bacteria consume the oxygen, they expel carbon dioxide. And you have an overconcentration of carbon dioxide and an atmosphere that is oxygen deficient. And like I said, I think in the first video in this unit, oxygen deficiency carbon monoxide kills more workers than all of the other hazardous vapors put together. If you look at the data, that's what you're going to find. And again, somebody's probably going to argue with me on that, but look at the data before you argue with me on that. If you look at the fatality data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you're going to see that oxygen deficient atmospheres and carbon monoxide are responsible for more workplace deaths than hydrogen sulfide and chlorine dioxide and phosgene gas and all of these other more exotic chemicals that are out there. Now, those things are dangerous. They're just not as common. It's very common to have oxygen deficiency in a workplace. It's very common to have carbon monoxide in a workplace at a dangerous level. And that's the reason for the number of deaths related to these two conditions. But what I want to talk about here, well, let me talk a little bit about asphyxiation first. That's what happened to these workers. They fell prey to what we call simple asphyxiation. Simple asphyxiation is when there's not enough oxygen available in the atmosphere. Too much CO2 in the work area displaces the oxygen. There's not enough for the organisms to survive. Now, it's not just CO2 that can displace oxygen. It can be other gases as well that can displace oxygen and result in oxygen deficient atmospheres. And really, anything below 19.5% is an oxygen deficient atmosphere. What I have in the table here are some of the physical effects that can occur in humans when oxygen levels reach 15%, 10%, 8%, 6%. At 15% oxygen, that's when you start seeing some relatively serious physical effects. Impaired physical coordination, impaired mental capacity. It starts to affect the worker's circulatory system, the respiratory system. At 10%, you see some very obvious symptoms present themselves. Bluish lips and an overall reduced ability to function. At 8%, if you're exposed at 8 minutes or more, it's likely to be fatal. At 8% oxygen level, exposure time of 6 minutes, 50% fatal. Exposure time of 4 to 6 minutes, the person may recover with appropriate treatment. At a 6% oxygen level, coma and death within 40 seconds. And that's this. I haven't seen any data or any report indicating what the actual oxygen level was in the Falls Creek incident, but those workers succumbed to the oxygen deficiency pretty quickly. So I'm guessing it's going to be 7, 6, 5% or lower in that, somewhere in that range. Because the second worker that went down the ladder, he didn't even make it a quarter way down the ladder, and he became unconscious. He lost consciousness and fell off of the ladder. So it's happened pretty quickly, so indicative of a pretty low oxygen concentration. But this is simple asphyxiation that we're talking about here, and that's what happened in the Falls Creek incident. Another type of asphyxiation is chemical asphyxiation. This is where the oxygen actually enters in the body. There's plenty of oxygen in the atmosphere. It gets into the body, but it's not being transported to the cells efficiently. There's something inside the body, something going on inside the body that's preventing the efficient transport of the needed oxygen to the cells at the cellular level. Carbon monoxide is a chemical asphyxiant. Carbon monoxide attaches to the red blood cells, forming carboxyhemoglobin. When carboxyhemoglobin forms in the red blood cells, there's no room for oxygen. So the oxygen is not being absorbed into the red blood cells, and it's not being carried to the tissues who need that oxygen. The blood is not able to absorb the oxygen. Carbon monoxide. There are other simple asphyxiants, chemical asphyxiants as well. H2S is a chemical asphyxiant. It works in the same way as far as how it disrupts our respiratory physiology. So oxygen deficiency, don't overlook that in your workplace as a potential danger. If you have workers entering a potentially dangerous area, forget the confined space regulations. Evaluate the area. Take readings without entering the area. Remote sampling, or take remote readings, which we'll talk about some ways that we can do that. If we take these readings and the concentration is lower than the STEL for whatever substance we're focused on, whether it's oxygen, carbon dioxide, H2S. If concentration is lower than the STEL, then we may have workers enter that space without further control. We also need to consider, before entering that potentially dangerous area, and this may be affected by our evaluation, is ventilation or other controls necessary before entry. Preferably, our other controls would also be an engineering control, just like ventilation. We also need to consider, based upon our evaluation, based upon our ability to implement engineering controls, we need to determine if PPE is necessary and what PPE is going to be necessary for safe entry. Do we need self-contained breathing apparatus devices to enter that area safely? And there are some substances that's really the only solution. There are some contaminants that's really the only solution. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about respiratory protection. That's going to be our last unit of the semester. And pardon my penmanship. I know nobody can read that, but respiratory protection is what I have spelled out there. Also, we need to consider, before we enter this potentially hazardous atmosphere, again, when I say potentially dangerous atmosphere, I'm talking specifically about, and I'll try to write a little more cleanly here, a hazardous atmosphere. Atmosphere. Had a brain glitch there for a second, forgot how to spell. Do we need rescue or emergency response procedures in place? Now, according to OSHA's confined space regulations, yeah, you do. You have to have this in place before entering a confined space, before entering a permit required confined space specifically. But to evaluate the area, we may need to use remote sampling procedures. How do we do that? How can readings be taken without entering the potentially hazardous area? We can use pumps, hoses, wands that would reach down into the space. Hoses and pumps are going to be your better option than some type of wand that you have to reach down into the space. The monitoring devices that have the built-in pumps and will suck the air into the device, those are really good devices for this type of sampling when we need to take remote readings. You put the hose on the device, and you can get hoses that are 15, 20 feet long. Drop that hose down into the space, or roll it out into the space, and turn your device on, and it's going to draw air into the device, and the device is going to provide readings of the concentration of substances in the space. You could use robots. Different types of robots have been used. The Fukushima power plant, Fukushima nuclear power plant that we talked about earlier in the semester, they use robots to go down and take periodic readings of the radiation levels. Underwater, they have swimming robots that will go down and take readings and do inspections. There could be robots in your workspace that could be implemented, that could be utilized to take remote readings from potentially hazardous workplaces. One thing that I would do a lot, and this is very, very low-tech, very simple approach, but you just tie your sniffer onto a string and slowly lower it down into the space. In the bridge construction industry, the first step in bridge construction is building your footings. A bridge footing can be 100 feet deep down into the ground, down to bedrock, beyond bedrock in many cases. And we drill a deep shaft. Drilling a deep shaft is part of the construction of that deep foundation. And occasionally you might have to have workers go down into those shafts, 100 feet, 50 feet, 75 feet. You want to test that area before putting them down in there. And one way that we would do it, we'd put a sniffer on a string, drop it down in there. If the alarm didn't go off, we were in good shape. Now, when we put men inside that drilled shaft, they would be wearing a personal monitoring device while they were in that space. And one thing that we saw over and over again, after about 5 to 8 minutes in that shaft, the oxygen deficiency monitor or the oxygen deficiency alarm went off, because they're in this deep shaft without any airflow. It didn't take them very long to use up the available oxygen in that space. Then we would pull them out. We had rescue equipment available if needed, if we needed to actually yank them out of the space. But we would always get them out of the space while they could still climb out of the space under their own power. Another option for remote sampling would be permanently installed sensors. If it's a work area that's in continual use, there's potential for repeated exposure to hazardous atmospheres. You can install permanent sensors that will provide a remote readout, be tied back to a computer system. Very, very similar to what we were talking about with area sampling in Unit 6. One thing that we need to take into consideration when we're using direct reading instruments or conducting any type of sampling is the vapor density of different gases. The vapor density can result in what we call stratification. Readings may indicate safe conditions when standing upright. Say we're in a space, but higher vapor density gases, they're going to sink. So when that worker is standing upright, he's fine, but when he bends over, he may be exposed to dangerous gases that have a vapor density greater than 1.0. Vapor density of 1.0, that's normal air. If it's greater, the vapor density is greater than 1.0, that means the gas is heavier than air and will sink at a lower strata and will be found at a lower strata. If it's less than 1.0, the vapor density of the gas will rise and will be found at a higher strata. Again, the atmosphere within our work area can be broken down into different strata. We have high strata, middle, and low. Higher vapor density gases are going to be in that lower strata. Lower density gases are going to be in that upper strata. May be perfectly fine in the breathing zone, but like it says over here, when that worker bends over, they could be bending over into a dangerous strata, into a strata that has a higher concentration of a harmful contaminant. So pay attention to vapor density when we're sending workers into potentially hazardous atmospheres. And when we're taking our samples, when we would take the samples with the string and the shafts, we would slowly lower the device and stopping at different levels to test the different strata for concentration of harmful gases at those different levels, at those different stratas. Also, rescue emergency response planning is very important. Anytime you have someone entering a potentially dangerous atmosphere, that entry needs to be monitored. There needs to be an attendant on the outside that is there in case something goes wrong. That attendant should not enter that space. If there's an emergency, the attendant should call for assistance. The attendant should not enter the space. Now, there can be exceptions to that if the attendant has the right equipment. But the first thing that needs to be considered when you have workers entering potentially dangerous areas, potentially hazardous atmospheres, is to have this monitor, have the hole watch or the space watch. It doesn't always have to be a hole. It's not always going to be a hole. Rescue retrieval devices. The rescue retrieval device could be as simple as a harness connected to a winch, and the winch is supported by a tripod. Yeah, that's assuming that the worker's going down into a space. But the worker may not always go down into a space. It may be a horizontal. He may be traveling horizontally into the space. But you can still use a harness connected to a winch, but you may not use a tripod in those instances. And the idea for this rescue device, this retrieval device, if they become unconscious in the space, no one has to go down and get them. You can winch them out. If this setup had been in place at Falls Creek, maybe only one worker had died. Maybe both of them survived. Maybe they would have been able to retrieve the first worker before irreparable harm had occurred physiologically. Another consideration when we're planning entry into potentially hazardous atmospheres: do we need escape air devices or emergency breathing devices? An emergency breathing device is a device that might have a 5-minute supply of breathable air. Something goes wrong, put the device on, you have 5 minutes to get out. And you can see these emergency breathing devices that you see them with up to 15 minutes of breathable air. Usually they're 5 to 15 minutes of breathable air. They can be donned very quickly, put it on, get out, and hopefully everything's good because they had the equipment they needed. As far as for rescue entry, you might need a self-contained breathing apparatus, which we'll talk more. We'll talk more about both of these when we talk about respiratory protection. The rescue team, the individuals, whether it's a team or an individual, should not enter without the proper equipment. Man goes down, the man goes down. Unless you want to be the next man down or the next person down, do not enter without proper equipment, without proper training. And we had 2 workers at Falls Creek. This would probably have been early 2000s. In, I believe it was Jinx, Oklahoma. 3 workers died inside of a drainage system, a storm drainage system. First one went down, lost consciousness. Second one went down, lost consciousness. Third one went down, he also died. They all 3 died. They hadn't been trained. They weren't following any kind of procedures. And you have to train workers in these scenarios to don't do what their instincts are telling them to do. Their instinct is telling them, hey, I've got to get down there and save my buddy. But that instinct can be the instinct that causes them to lose their lives. When entering dangerous locations, consider coordinating with first responders in advance. This is something we did at Kiewit. When we knew we had a confined space entry, we would have the fire department notified. In one case, the fire department even came out and did some training in advance. It was a pretty hairy confined space, dangerous, tight space, deep in the ground. They actually came out and trained on location, so they would be prepared if they needed to do a rescue at that location. And that's not always going to happen. It's not always going to be necessary, but it is best practice to let first responders know when you have workers entering a confined space or other potentially hazardous atmosphere or work area. What else can I say? Again, what we're talking about here applies to confined space entry, but it doesn't have to be technically a permit required confined space for some of these best practices to be implemented. Speaking of OSHA and confined space, if you have a chance to take the OSHA 30, we go into more detail talking about the actual OSHA regulations applicable to confined space entry. They really aren't that complex. A lot of companies don't like them because they have to do some planning. They have to buy some equipment or rent some equipment. Companies that enter confined spaces, they don't have to own the equipment like anything else that can be rented. The tripods, other equipment, or personal protective equipment can be rented. And usually it can be rented for a lot less money than what one OSHA citation would cost the company. Definitely a lot less money than what it would cost the company if they have a worker seriously injured or a fatality occurs.